Welcome, everyone, to NACAA 365. My name is Tyrone Fisher. I am your vice president, and we're glad to have part two of our program today. We're going to let Blake Carter come on board, and he's going to tell you about the program today and introduce his speakers. And so the floor is yours, Blake.
Thank you, Tyrone. Robin, if you want to go ahead and share the screen, I appreciate you. Um, my name's Blake Carter. I'm the Ag and Natural Resources Agent in Lawrence County, Georgia. I'm also the Ag Econ Chair. So I'm one of the two speakers for today's session. Nathan did a great job last time, and we're going to kind of build on that, me and Robin, and we'll introduce both of ourselves a little bit more in just a second. But for the program today, farm succession planning is a complex system, but today we're going to really talk about the communication piece to it because that's oftentimes where things start to unravel and families start to have conflicts in this process. It usually revolves around the facilitation and the communication aspect. So introducing ourselves, Robin, if you want to hit that next slide. My name is Blake Carter. Like I said, I've been in Extension for over 6 years, almost seven now. And I just finished up my PhD in Ag Leadership, Communication, Education this past December. And combining that with the ag business side, really, this is kind of the dynamics that I can bring to the table with this conversations, just seeing the communication aspect, the family dynamics, generational differences, that kind of piece. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that during my time, but I'll let Robin go ahead and introduce herself.
Awesome. So I am the one controlling slides. So if they go sideways, you can blame me. But my name's Robyn Stewart. I am also a county agent here with the University of Georgia. Blake and I actually started our careers right at around the same time. So we're both about 6.5 years in. And we just happen to be very similar because I'm also finishing a PhD in the ALEC department here at the University of Georgia. Although the majority of my work has focused more in the animal science realm and the public education realm. So Blake has done a bit more of the leadership and comm side. I've done a little bit more of the public education end. And so I'm going to chip in at the second half of the talk, talking about how we facilitate some of those difficult conversations and some of the skills that we as agents can bring to the table for those moments.
Awesome. And since we kind of went through the recap there, Rob, if you want to go ahead and skip that next slide, we can go jump right on into the good stuff. Before we get into some of the communication pieces and the facilitation part with Robin's side, I want to kind of set the stage. And this is data from the 2022 Census of Agriculture reports that we do. And the last one that came out said the U.S. farm producers' average age is 58.1 years old. Over one third are over 65 or older. And not only that, but when you start looking at trends, there are actually clear declines in some of the other areas. And you can see on the screen 45 to 54 and 55 to 64, 45 to 54, 55 to 64. Both of those are losing number of farmers in those categories pretty significantly. Now, that might not be that big of a deal because if you think about it, as people progress from 2017 to 2022, you would think that they would move through the different age categories, and that makes sense. But when you start looking at younger producers, the number of them, it's not the same level to replace that older generation as we go. So and that creates a little bit of a concern, a little bit more urgency, because it's more important now to focus on that sustainability in those future generations than ever before. Transition planning is no longer an option. It's pretty much essential for our long-term continuity. The numbers don't lie, and when I was going through this, I was like, man, we're keep getting older, and we're not getting any younger in the farming community. So we have to figure out ways to make sure that next generation is set up for success for us to continue our family-owned farms in the United States. Robin, if you want to hit that next one. Succession planning, though, is a little bit of a misunderstood concept. A lot of people view it as a legal transaction, and there is legalities part of it. Nathan went over that and talked about that a little bit last time, but it's a layered transition process. It's not just one thing, and it unfolds over time. So there are about five elements that I wanted to kind of touch on that I picked out as part of the transition process. And first is the management transfer piece. And typically you see this on a farm where it gradually shifts operational leadership. So maybe one person, your oldest son, you let them control what crops are being planted in the crop management side. But maybe your middle daughter, maybe she's over the marketing part of the crop. So each one of them have a different piece of management that maybe you're giving up, the older generation's giving up to them, so they can kind of take a little bit of that function away, that management pressure. But it hardly ever works all at one time. So you start to see them get like one piece of the farm management process, another piece added to it, but it's rarely that all of it gets transferred from one generation to the next. Second would be decision rights. So this is where tension is probably the most often seen or felt. Decision rights are not just about tasks, but it's about the authority piece to it, and that's the complex piece that we often overlook. It's who has that final say in a disagreement, who's the tiebreaker, who carries that financial risk and burden. When families fail to clearly have defined decision rights, conflict starts to happen a little bit faster than you think. The third element is about labor roles. Now, on farms, the next generation may have worked for years without clearly having any defined roles, and that's even the older generation too. I don't know many farms that have really good set uh, outline job descriptions or expectations that are clearly put, because if they are hiring outside, it might be the most elementary job description or job posting that you will see, because a lot of times it's not necessarily a lot of upper skilled labor they're after. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't farms that have really good HR parts and components, but oftentimes we don't see that in a lot of the family farms. So that can create a little bit of frustration when there's not that kind of explicitly wrote out, defined role. A lot of the questions start coming up of, is the next generation an employee? Are they a partner? Are they a future owner? Those are some of the things you got to make distinctions and criteria, because it matters more, not just financially, but also emotionally for people. This whole family farm piece, you can look at it from a business side, but we have to keep in mind that it's still that emotional attachment from a family dynamic piece that's involved that makes this a lot more complicated than just that transition or transaction. Um, the next two would be the ownership and then the identity. And I'll talk more about identity in a minute, but the ownership transfer is basically where you're the easiest part. That's what most people think of. That's like your land, your equipment, your business entities. Those are all documentable. They're all tangible assets. But the final piece is identity. And for many producers in farming is not just an occupation, right? It's who we are. It's who they are. Research in agricultural family systems consistently shows that retirement and succession conversations usually are delayed because stepping back feels like stepping aside. And we'll talk more about that dynamic in a minute. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is you can transfer land in a day, but you cannot transfer leadership, trust, or identity overnight. And that's what we're going to kind of talk some more about. Starting with the generational differences piece, and the way I thought about doing when I was making this, one of the things that it's hard to just talk about the generational differences and kind of nail down how it relates to farming specifically. And one commonality when you start looking at transitions and conversations I've had with family farms that are going through this process is that they're looking at things through two different lenses. Okay. And the way I thought that would be the easiest to view it would be the lenses of risk that these two generations are looking through. So older generations are often valuing stability. They want land preservation, debt caution. They have built their operations during periods of high interest rates, volatile markets, and past financial crises. They may have experienced farm consolidation, lender pressure over the years, or years where survival was required because there was no other option. For them, risk management often means protecting equity, minimizing that leverage piece, and preserving what's already built. Now, on the flip side is the younger generations. And now, if any of y'all are familiar with like the any kind of innovations and adoption studies and things like that, typically younger generations are more likely to be your adopters of new technology or the ones that are be open to trying new things. And that's the case for their risk management lens as well. So they are often more comfortable with technology integrations, data-driven decision making, direct-to-consumer marketing, alternative enterprises, regenerative practices, diversification at its core. That's what they're looking through. They may have viewed controlled debt as actually a growth tool instead of being scared of it. Um, for them, risk management means adapting quickly, capturing new markets, and staying competitive in the environment that we're in. But these differences are not about one generation being reckless or more risk averse than the other. They reflect lived experiences, and that's the other piece to it, right? They've all had their different lens and different things that have shaped the realities that they live and the view that they are viewing these things through. So one generation, when you're having these conversations at the table, you have to think about one generation survived by tightening those margins and avoiding unnecessary exposure, while the other generation sees survival as requiring adaptation and strategic growth. Both are responding to risk differently, or both are responding to risk, but they're just defining that risk differently. And so for extension agents, Robyn's going to talk a little bit about the facilitation side, but that's key for us to keep reminding families to articulate those definitions of what that risk is. Now, odds are you're not going to get somebody that's just going to tell you what how they view their risk word for word. But as you listen, you can start piecing together maybe one view's going in one direction, new direction for you pick part of the farm, and that could be that innovation, that diversification. While the older generations just want to stay alive, stay steady. They don't want to incur any more debt because they might not have retirement plans, and that's a legit issue that you have to think about. Robyn, if you want to hit the next one. So generational conflict, and I'm going to talk on conflict a little bit, not all forms of conflict, but I'm going to talk about the generational conflict piece specifically. It's rarely about age. In reality, a lot of times it's about roles. And I feel this as a young agent, young person in extension. When I first started, there is a big generation gap. So we see that. And so sometimes I can feel that frustration a little bit at times. So it is just our views of the different generations. In many farm transitions, the tension is actually about role ambiguity layered with emotion, and a lot of that, like I said, it goes back to being a family. There's more emotion tied when it's something that's personal. The way we talk to our family is not the way that we would talk to somebody that's not a family member in a professional setting, and we have to keep that in mind. So for the senior generation, the underlying concern is that fear of that losing control piece. Okay. In this context, it's not just about that decision-making power. It represents responsibility they've carried, the risk, the sacrifice, but also the pride that they carry around. They have weathered many storms. So they're thinking about not just the farm being passed on, but they're trying to figure out their own self. What does that look like after the farm is not what their sole uh, identity is? So there are some questions that it might trigger in their head when you start talking about transition. So to kind of understand that, some of these questions that might go through their mind are, what if they make a mistake, the next generation? What if a lender loses confidence because they see my son as more of a risk than me? What if expansion jeopardizes what we've built, what I've built? What if I'm no longer needed? These fears are rarely voiced directly. Like I said, you're going to have to listen through as you start to hear their stories and hear the conversations. But they can show up in many different ways. You can have micromanagement come up, delayed decision making, or even a reluctance to even talk about transition. Oh, we'll do it next week. Oh, we'll do it. We'll talk about it later. We'll talk about it later. So making sure that you set those dates and actually have accountability is a big part. Now, on the other side, the next generation often carries a fear of lacking the voice and authority. So typically, successors have worked on the farm for many years, but that's not always the case. And we'll talk about that in a second too. But most of the time, you have some sweat equity in there. But it's been informal. There's not really clarity about who has the decision rights or the ownership trajectory. Maybe they have some parts that they can influence, while the others are maybe made by the older generation, but they feel stuck in kind of a assistant role. They're viewed as the second in command instead of the first in command. Their internal questions may sound like, when will I actually have authority? What does my future here really look like? Without clarity, frustration does tend to build over time. Without structured conversations, assumptions turn into reality. They harden into reality. And what appears externally as generational stubbornness is often just two different insecurities coming together. One generation fears losing that relevance, while the other fears never gaining it at all. So, going into farming as an identity, I did want to touch on this. Um, for decades, farmers, their daily routines have revolved around agriculture. Okay. Their daily routines, weather forecast, check the weather, make sure it's good. Planting schedules. Okay. We outline that. Livestock health, market reports, daily tasks and chores around the farm are all tied to their identity in that farming piece. Their social networks are tied to agriculture. I don't know how many times I've been with farmers and they're just calling each other as they're riding the tractor, just talking and checking in on each other, but that's who they're talking with, right? But they talk about farming. They talk about what they're doing. So what happens when that's removed? What happens when they don't have that piece to talk about anymore? Their reputation in the community is tied to agriculture. Their sense of competence and contribution is tied to agriculture. So when we use the word retirement, the older generation may not hear that word. They may not hear transition. They may hear step aside. You're no longer needed. Your authority is over. And they can deeply feel threatened, but also kind of a little bit having like an identity crisis, right? So research in ag has consistently shown this about the retirement planning is often delayed, not because of financial confusion, but oftentimes it's identity disruption, like I mentioned. Um, for many senior producers, the farm is not something they own, but is who they are. If the plan, when you're talking transition, does not address identity, conversations will stall almost immediately. You have got that's a piece that they might not want to dive into or open up about, but it's a piece that's very much so needed to be talked about. We can talk about retirement and having financial security going forward, but you've got to make sure that they are understanding the transition is more than just money. It's who they are, right? And that they're not losing a piece of them. Um, some of the questions for us we can use to kind of gauge some of this is what does your next chapter look like? How would you like to stay involved on the farm? What decisions are most meaningful for you to continue influencing? And what legacy matters the most to you beyond just the land and the farm itself? The conversations are these questions kind of shift that conversation from exit to evolution to adaptation to change. Succession planning should not frame retirement as a removal of the individual from the farm itself, but it should frame it as a repositioning from operator to maybe a mentor, from manager to advisor. When senior producers see a meaningful role for themselves, resistance typically decreases. Identity does not disappear in transition, but it transforms. So, as we talk a little bit more about the identity, now we have that framework. Robyn, if you want to hit the next one, we're going to talk a little bit about the language that we choose. All right. And there's a big part of this. And I'm a firm believer if you start listening to how people word things, it can totally change the meaning. It can also change my reaction to it. And if I'm more willing to open up and have a conversation, or do I feel like I'm being attacked or threatened? And it's all about word choice and tone. It's about how we communicate. So one of the most simple, the simplest pieces is the most powerful tool. And that's all it is language reframing. So changing from a defensive language to a more reframed language that's more open and inviting. In succession conversations, defensiveness is often triggered not by the issue itself, but by how it was framed. Words like change, modernize, outdated, you need to, can unintentionally signal criticism even when it wasn't meant to. And again, I go back to us talking to our families or even people that we're comfortable with. I'm going to talk to them in a different way than I would someone that I've never met or in a professional sense because I'm more familiar with them. So I don't hold myself accountable on my word choice and my tone as much. I let that kind of guard go down. So in these cases, a lot of times you're going to see that where they're going to have that more emotional charge to them, even though they might not realize it. When a young producer says we need to change the way we've always done this, the senior generation may actually hear what you built isn't good enough. When a senior producer says, "We've always done it this way," the next generation may hear, "Your ideas aren't valued." As extension professionals, we can model and teach reframing language that lowers threat. The issue isn't resistance, it's all about perceived threat. And so I really want you to think about that as we talk through the language and facilitation piece of how we can make better choices in terms of how we word things. And it might not be that you're having to tell them how to say things, but just having conversations with the families as they're going through this and giving examples of how to frame what they're trying to express can go a long way. So there is an art form to it. If you think about Robyn, if you want to click the next one, I'm going to talk about reframing, and there's three important things that reframing really does, and it's super important. It signals respect for the past when it comes to farming and this conversation that we're having. The second thing it does is it acknowledges uncertainty rather than blame. Okay. And then finally, it shifts the conversation from a personal attack to a structural. Remember, this is a business, right? So there are pieces of this that we have to keep reminding our family members and people involved. There are pieces that are that you can't take the emotion out of it, but it is at the end of the day still some of that business transaction stuff going on. So having that conversation, being able to have that distinction is important. The phrase preserve and improve is extremely powerful in agriculture families. Legacies, continuing on legacies, that pride I was talking about that farmers carry around. Preserve and grow are two really good words that you can put in your toolbox for that younger generation to use because there's rarely any time where that's not going to give a positive reaction or response. They want to continue. At the end of the day, farmers don't want to just end their legacy with their generation, right? Especially if it's multi-gen, they want to continue that. It would be almost like a slap in the face if they didn't. And that's kind of if you look up any of any research that's being done on farm transition, that's part of it. That's some of the stuff they found is just the words about legacy and honor carry a lot of weight in the farming community. As facilitators, we're not just guiding content, but we're trying to model our tone. And so that's where that reframing piece comes in, what we can offer in that regard as communication. Now, there is one piece of communication that happens quite often in succession that on farm that I wanted to discuss, and that's communication bottlenecking. So this is the common problem. Communication bottleneck occurs when information slows down. It becomes distorted or stops because it must pass through a single person, a single point. That would be the oldest generation farm figurehead. Let's use them as the center point. But that could also be someone that may not be as hands-on, such as a widowed spouse, for example. And maybe it got thrown on her to make the decisions. So you have different levels of experience of the farm itself that also plays a role in this. So think of communication bottlenecks like a narrow section of a grain auger that's gotten backed up. All the grain cannot pass through like it should, leading to a slowdown. As far as communication bottlenecking goes, the root of the issue is more complex than just a blockage. Some of the common causes of communication bottlenecking include situations when one person controls all approvals. There's poor delegation, communication fatigue, or lack of convenience. So think of the picture here. You've got one child that's on the farm while you have others that are off the farm. Maybe the ones off the farm don't know what's actually going on or what's being invested or how the money's being done at the farm because they don't see their father or their figurehead or their mother that's talking through it on a day to day. Maybe they only have a phone call once a month. So there's often times where, especially like in our jobs, we get tired of talking to so much during the day that when I get home, I don't want to talk. Same concept here too. They might not want to talk through all these business decisions again with all of their children to get everybody on the same page. So slow response, going into the communication bottlenecks for the families, avoidance of difficult discussions is a key sign of this. So a lot of the research points to a couple barriers, and that's one of them. Discussions about death, control, and fairness are very uncomfortable, especially when it's tied to family and tied to your identity. A lot of times we just want to brush them off. And farmers are notorious for not opening up to themselves and their emotions, right? They like to bury things or swipe it under the rug. Other aspects that are unique for farming communities are tied closely with identity, lack of sustainable retirement plans, which is another piece. They also add those layers of complexity. These factors contribute to families adopting a wait and see approach, is what a lot of times is what we see, where there are countless examples across the country from extension research documenting kind of the unraveling of some of these horror stories with farm succession plans. But extension does have a fit into this puzzle, right? So as extension professionals, we can actually normalize these conversations, reduce a stigma around it. And I know if you're doing any of the mental health or rural health stuff, stigma is something that we talk about all the time. And if you tell a farmer we're trying to reduce your stigma, they're going to look at you like you got five heads. But at the end of the day, that's what we can do. We might not necessarily need to word it that way to them, but that's what we're here to do. We want to cover throughout this presentation some different ways that y'all can utilize some different tools and tactics to kind of do that. So when Robyn gets to her portion, she'll really get to unpack some of the toolkit for us as agents. So before we do that, there's a couple more slides of mine that I wanted to kind of go over. The first is a scenario, and I use this because it's the classic one. And I think every one of us on here on this Zoom has probably heard this situation or know of a farming family that has this situation. So there are two siblings, okay, and the parents of that on the farm, the older generation. One of the siblings returns to the farm full time, so they went back to college and came back home. They worked. They've been there for 18 years. They had a disagreement with one of their siblings or their sibling on the future of the farm, and so that's caused a lot of friction between him and the other sibling. Child two, on the other hand, has never worked or never liked working or life on the farm. So they wanted to go to med school and they did. And now they're in California being a surgeon. They're living a great life, had a massive falling out with their sibling about the farm and has stopped coming around, only calls mom and dad. So they don't even see each other. The family's in an interesting position where they have two kids that are having a conflict. The mom is scared their relationship with child two will be over if they don't treat the children equally. The dad feels pinched between a rock and a hard place because he's looking at the sustainability of the farm, but also not fracturing the family. No one is trying to create a conflict, but without intentional clarity, equal division can unintentionally undermine business continuity. So, and I'm going to mention that in a second, but Nathan talked about it a lot during his. Fair and equal are not the same thing. This scenario forces families to confront a difficult question. So this is a good example scenario to use with farmers and families going through this because it forces them to answer, is fairness about equal dollar amounts or is it about the sustainability of their operation and their families? As extension, our role is to not solve this equation, but help families define the different variables in their own equation. So a couple more before I switch it over. Again, equal is not always fair. Equal means the same dollar amount. It is clean, it's symmetrical, and it's simple. It's usually the feel good choice, right? It's the easiest one. It's simple on paper. The parents are like, oh yeah, well, if we just make it equal, nobody will have bad blood because they can't be angry that both of them got the same amount. But that's not always how each of the siblings or kids feel, right? Equitable, however, considers contribution. And I love that Nathan mentioned this, the last one about sweat equity on the farm and earning their stripes to have uh, they're qualified to actually sit at that table to have some of the inheritance from that farm come to them. For example, a farming successor may have accepted below minimum market wages for years. They have assumed operational risk. They have even foregone other career opportunities to stay on board. Equitable distribution might involve life insurance for off-farm hires, structured buy-in agreements, or compensation adjustments. But the key here is to not choose equal or equitable for them. The key is forcing the family to define what fairness means in their family's context before crisis defines it for them, which often leads to a fractured family, or in our case, the worst case, a loss of the farm itself. So my last little piece before I switch it over to Robyn is just another caution when it's and complexity to this conversation, and that's the hidden stakeholder aspect. So who is not in the room? So we've talked about the parents and the kids, but that's not really the only people that we have to really think about in this equation. There's spouses, there's in-laws, off-farm hires that might be heavily involved that have been in the on the family farm for years. Lenders or advisors when appropriate. All of these things are stakeholders. All of these people are stakeholders, and if they're excluded early, they will react later. Typically, in research, it shows that exclusion breeds resentment. And that's another big take home with you for everybody is when you start talking through this, you don't need everybody in the room, but you really need to sit down and tell the families to really think through who are the key players on their farm and making their decisions. Because this is usually when that bottlenecking can occur, is when you leave out people that are key influences to the business itself. All right, with that, I'm going to let Robyn take over and kind of go from here and tell us a little bit more about how we can be facilitators as extension agents.
Awesome. Thank you, Blake. Can everybody hear me okay? Cool. Thank you. So I'm stepping in kind of on the back half of Blake's, talking now more about the processes that we use to mediate these conflicts and mediate these difficult discussions. So we know that succession is hard, right? If you've learned nothing from last week and this week, it is hard for a number of ways, right? Partly because of the logistical side of transition, but also because the emotional side of it. And what we find is that we've got the information, we've got the technicalities on how to do things. And especially as county agents, we're good at being subject matter experts. We're good at being content experts. But what a lot of the transition where it comes down to is the conversation piece and truly being a facilitator. And I know we've said that word a lot today, but if you don't know what a facilitator is, it is somebody who makes a process easier. So we're not coming in telling people how to divide the farm or who should get what or what fair and equitable is, but we can come into the room and say, here are some of the ways that we might shape this conversation to be productive rather than something that creates conflict and stress in the relationship. So when families argue about succession, right, when we argue about money and land and equipment, it's usually not really stopping there, right? As Blake pointed to, those are just surface issues. There's things that are easy to point at and argue about, but underneath there's something else happening, right? When people are fighting about land value, they're fighting about recognition, they're fighting about control, they're fighting about fear, right? And when we name those emotions, we start to be able to recognize them both in ourselves and in the people in the room. So part of the skill with facilitation is starting to dig deeper than the surface conflict. So when we start taking a statement that's about money or land or equipment or the kind of concrete aspects of transition, and we start saying, you know, it sounds like I've heard you say this or that. Could it be that this emotion is underlying it? And one thing I would encourage you to do is it's okay to say an emotion, because if you're wrong, they're going to tell you. Okay, so there's nothing worse than leaving that unsaid and not having it out in the open. So our job is to hear past that headline, past that initial issue. We want to understand what it is that they're feeling, why they're feeling that way, and help them articulate that emotion or that risk that they're trying to navigate. When we start slowing down the conversation long enough to actually name the underlying feelings, the fear, the uncertainty, the loss, the dispute that's on the surface usually becomes easier to work on. So the first thing as a facilitator is listening for the emotion behind the argument, not just the surface content that they give you. Another thing that's really critical for our structuring these conversations is actually providing a structure to follow. Because the worst thing, and I know Blake kind of alluded to it, is when you're tired, you're worn out, the last thing you want to do is have this conversation and somebody walks in the door and all they want to do is talk about something you do not care about, right? And it's hard not to be frustrated and upset that they want to have a discussion that you're not prepared for But what they hear is that you're not available, you don't care, it's not important to them. Okay? So the conversations that happen in the tractor or the pickup truck or at the kitchen table escalate quickly because there's no structure or container for that conversation. We haven't come to that discussion point with an understanding of everybody being prepared, everybody having the ideas that they need to think through kind of established in their mind, and instead we're putting people on the spot to engage in a way that's not helpful. So encouraging families to be intentional with their scheduling. So actually put this meeting on your calendar. Have an agenda. Say, we're not going to cover every piece of transition today, but we do want to cover, the land distribution amongst our youth or our kids, right? Maybe we want to talk about planning for the next 5 years of crops. What capital improvements do we need to make that are going to be staring us down? So be very clear about what the goal of the conversation is and what it's not, and stick to it. So during that conversation, make sure that you're setting ground rules that allow people to feel like they have the ability to participate, feel like their input is heard, and document what is going to happen after. So if we say we're going to do something as a result of this discussion, who's going to be responsible for that? What does that follow-up look like? Structure doesn't make these conversations super rigid. It doesn't have to, but it makes them safer for the people involved with them. And when families start to see the transition as a process with phases that they can walk through, where they're not having to solve every single question the minute they are confronted with it, it means that they are able to reduce their anxiety and be more willing to engage in that conversation. So another way we can do this is breaking this into stages, right? So I just said we don't have to have the entire conversation at once. So when we do that, when we think we're going to figure out vision and control and ownership and transition of equipment all at the same time, people start shutting down because we're not asking that older farmer to give up a piece of the farm. We're saying, oh, we want you to give it all over today. And that feels really daunting. So if we phase this in a way that we're transitioning slowly as a process, it gives everybody something concrete to work towards, and it doesn't feel quite as overwhelming. So a good way to start is starting with vision. So what are we doing here? Like, why do we have the farm? What does it mean? What does it mean to the family? Who is the most important stakeholder here? What are we trying to protect, right? What is our legacy going to be for that farm? And making sure that the vision for this farm is aligned between the people involved with the decisions, right? Blake said, we get tension between the older generation saying, I built this from the ground up, I want it to be able to sustain itself, and a new generation coming in and saying, well, we've got to be competitive to stay alive, so we need to make big changes. And those two things aren't mutually exclusive. It just means that the conversation has to be had around what the vision is, what it means, and who is going to be involved with it. And that brings me to role and authority. So who is responsible for what? Blake said we often see the transition happen slowly. So we'll see people with different roles and responsibilities prior to this transition planning process, but really outlining who is responsible for what, where are the boundaries, who's allowed to have what authority, right? So let's say that you are put in charge of making management decisions for the crop. Are you allowed to make the final decision on that? Or is there a process to follow for everybody to weigh in? And if there's going to be a process to follow, it should be the same process across different areas of the operation. It shouldn't be unique to a single person or a single area. Then we can talk into compensation. So how is work valued on the farm? What is fair, right? And this talks into Nathan's component on sweat equity too, right? So if you've got a youth or a kid or something like that that has been involved with the farm and working there and probably making less than they should, are we going to compensate them in some way during this transition period? How do we ensure that that older generation maybe is able to retire and feels comfortable loosening those reins a little bit more? And only after we've targeted these three things do we really start talking about ownership structures and that official formal transition over to that new generation. Lastly, we figure out the timeline, right? So how quickly does this happen? How fast does this process need to move? And that can be dictated by a lot of things. It can be dictated by the individual's health, right? Maybe it's dictated by a spouse or a widowed spouse or something like that. Or maybe there's some other things that are coming into question with the timing of it. But identifying a timeline of, are we going to do this within 6 months, a year, 5 years, so that everybody knows what to expect and what needs to happen between now and the next step in the process for everybody to feel comfortable with it. When you're able to move through this step-by-step process, the clarity of what is happening and why it's happening increases. And when clarity increases, so does trust. And trust is really what allows succession to happen without creating a lot of conflict. So as a facilitator, one of the most powerful tools we have isn't giving advice, right? I don't think Blake or I would ever recommend you go in and try to be the content expert for somebody's succession plan. But what we can do is ask questions. When we start to tell people what to do, even with the best intentions, we're going to be met with resistance, especially with something like succession planning that is so emotionally driven. But when we ask questions, we invite reflection and we encourage these people to think more deeply about this process and about what it looks like. And that allows the generation of perception as well as their own concerns and their own priorities. And it's hard to put a name on something that you haven't thought through yourself. When we start asking some of the future-focused questions, right? So what does success look like in 10 years? What worries you most about this process? What must be true for this to feel fair and equitable? Or what role do you want to have moving forward? Allows people to step out of kind of the reactive thinking model and into a more proactive, reflective way of evaluating what it could be. These questions also help bring fears into the light. So they uncover things that are underlying some of that tension that we mentioned before, things that maybe they don't want to say out loud. And I know talking to ag agents about encouraging farmers to be vulnerable is a whole different ballgame and a whole nother question, right? We can tell you to do this all day long, and whether you'll be met with that vulnerability is a whole different question. But our job, again, is to allow the space for it to happen. And they're going to meet us wherever it is comfortable for them. And maybe even if they're not willing to voice those emotions right out in the open, maybe it gives them a little bit more permission to be more introspective and think about it from their own standpoint. Sometimes the most productive moment in a meeting is silence too. So we can ask questions, but it's really important that we be okay with sitting in some discomfort and sitting with some silence. Maybe it's awkward, right? And allowing people the time to think and reflect and to process, because we don't all process in the same way. And those quiet moments sometimes can spark some big breakthroughs. So how do we de-escalate conflict, right? So we're hoping that we're going to go in, ask questions, help guide some of the emotional side of this, but there's usually inevitably going to be somebody upset, right? It is just going to happen, and it's not a sign that something is wrong in the process, it's just part of it. So our goal is not to eliminate or prevent conflict, but it's to stop it from spiraling out of control. One of the simplest tools we can use is reflective listening, and this is something we can model. So using phrases like, what I hear from you is X, Y, and Z, lets people feel like we are really naming what we're getting out of them. And maybe we're wrong. Like I have had it where I've said, I heard this, and somebody says, no, that's not at all what I said, right? And that allows you to build more clarity into that conversation. And it helps diffuse some of the tensions when what you're hearing and what they're saying aren't aligned. Another thing that we think about is using I statements. So always speaking from your own perspective of I feel or I understand it this way helps everybody feel like they are owning their own emotions and not necessarily putting them on other people. It feels very accusatory to be told, well, you always do this, or you did this, or putting you statements puts that burden on the other person and then is, again, going to create tension. It's going to create defensiveness, whereas an I statement is typically going to be a little bit better received. When emotions do get really high, it's okay to take a breath. Sometimes that's a good time to recognize the need for a break, to step away from the table, because pausing isn't failure, it's regulation. And it gives everybody a time to sit down, think, calm themselves, and kind of re-engage in a way that's more constructive. Lastly, for us as agents, managing conflict in these conversations isn't about solving the problem. It's about creating space for managing those emotions and moving forward in a logical way. So until we've acknowledged some of the raw feelings behind it, arguments tend to escalate instead of resolve. And sometimes it is in our best interest to refer these individuals to another resource if it is going to help progress the conversation. So it depends on what stage you get to, but sometimes as an agent, I would remind you that your job is not to be a punching bag and your job is not to get in the middle of a conflict, but that hopefully we can help reduce some of the stress there. And even just by being a third party, sometimes we can reduce the things that people will say to one another because we aren't family and we aren't engaged there. So these are some guidelines for what to do if we are out of our realm of expertise and out of our limit. So we can guide these conversations, provide structures, and help name emotions, but we're not experts in everything. So our job is to provide the education and the tools and a process, but we don't draft legal documents, we don't decide what's equitable for a family, and we don't manage things like mental health on our own. So those responsibilities need to belong to individuals who are trained for them. So sometimes red flags are easy to see, right? If there's legal documents, if we have like really strong financial distress, if emotions are becoming really combative and really aggressive, those are circumstances where it's time to pull in people like attorneys or mediators or financial counselors that may be able to help move this process forward. Setting clear boundaries about what you're willing to engage with isn't just about keeping yourself safe, but it also helps the families because it helps make sure the conversation is productive and it keeps everybody accountable and prevents harm. So again, this is kind of getting to the end of our section, but extension can provide a unique role in the succession process. We're trusted, we're neutral, and in a lot of cases, we have long-standing relationships with the family before this conversation even comes to light. And that trust and familiarity means that we're in a rare opportunity to help families navigate emotional topics without adding additional pressure or bias. Part of what we do is we normalize the difficulty of these conversations. We acknowledge that talking about control and fairness and identity isn't easy, and that's okay. But we introduce structure so the conversations don't spiral. We share practical tools that give families a framework to work through complex decisions together, and we help connect families to the right professionals when they need them. Our job, though, is not to solve the problem for them. We don't dictate outcomes, we don't impose our own decisions on them. We help them move forward. We guide the process, we create space, and we surface underlying concerns. And when families feel like they have the support and the mechanisms to address the elephants in the room, they're able to move forward with the succession planning. So there are some tools that we can provide. So most families aren't avoiding succession because they don't care. They avoid it because they don't know where to start. So the issues feel too big, too emotional, too complicated. And without a clear starting point, it's really easy to put off. So we can provide some simple tools that break the inertia and help families start with something tangible. So something as simple as a structured meeting planning template that lets them evaluate what topics they're going to address, in what order, and what decisions need to be made. Something like a vision worksheet helps them align around the why. What does this farm look like now? What does it need to look like in 5 or 10 years? What does it look like in 100 years? A decision rights chart can help clarify who has authority over what area of the farm, reducing assumptions and confusion. Something like an equal but equitable worksheet can force families to actually define fairness and defend their decisions. And then a referral list gives them additional resources beyond us that can give them links to professionals or to other, print media or things like that that might be useful through the process. So each of these tools just standing on their own is not helpful, right? If somebody comes in and says, I need help with succession planning, don't just throw a pile of paper at them and tell them good luck. But these can help create some structure to the process that is valuable in getting them started. As agents, confidence comes from preparation. So when we walk into a succession planning knowing the data, the research, and the resources we have available, we feel more confident and our families can feel confident too. Using national data to help show urgency, right? Just like Blake did, we're concerned about our farm population. We're concerned about the amount of farmland that is being lost every year. We're concerned about succession delays that influence the overall sustainability of their operation. And that creates context for why planning matters now, not just in 5 or 10 years. Research validates our approach and is what we're grounded in as Extension. Preparation also means building your referral network ahead of time, so knowing where you can send people, knowing who in your area specializes in agriculture succession and agricultural topics, and then working towards building trust. So again, families are willing to engage with us because of the position we hold in our communities and with their farms. They need to believe that you are competent, neutral, and well prepared, and that confidence is one of those components. So here is what a facilitation pathway might look like. As I said, succession facilitation is a process. It's not an event, so it's not going to happen at once. But we need to work on intake, so getting to know our family and our farm, getting to know the vision, their objectives for what they want to achieve, what does a successful transition look like for this family, and who is responsible for what, and who has authority for what. Once we have all of those things kind of outlined, we can look at the options for fulfilling ownership needs, for transitioning different parts of the business, or compensation that align with the goals that they've identified. We can refer them if we need to, if they need specialty consultants. And then just like anything else, we want to go ahead and follow up and make sure that they are getting their needs met and addressing any challenges that they might encounter along the way. Even somebody who is starting this process, taking a really small step, a very small conversation with you can spark a big change. So don't discount the little steps early in the process because they can make a really big difference for that family. So when the conversations get hard, here are a couple of things I would recommend you remember. Silence is expensive, right? So avoiding the conversation doesn't preserve harmony, it delays the disruption. Succession is about relationships first and foremost. It's about the people, the roles, and the families more than it's about the land, equipment, and the legal documents. Communication and context matter, so how we frame our questions, how we surface underlying concerns, and how we manage emotional dynamics shapes whether a family can move forward or whether they get stuck in a conflict cycle. We have to acknowledge identity. As Blake said, farming isn't just a business, it's who they are, and when we ignore that, even the best planning can stall. Families also need to define what fair and equitable means for them, rather than letting assumptions fill those gaps. And then leaning on structure, because having intentional meetings and agendas that follow up this process transforms emotional conversations into productive processes. And as agents, our role is to guide, facilitate, and model that structure to create a climate that allows them to move forward through these steps. So this has been a lot of information. I know we're kind of close to time. I think we have a few minutes for questions. But Blake and I are more than happy to chat with you or have conversations with you as needed. Feel free just to reach out to us. Our emails are there.
Okay. Great job. Or do the virtual reaction clap as well. I see no questions in the chat. The floor is open. You can unmic if I have any questions for our speakers.
I would give a plug. I don't know if other universities have this, but UGA has a facilitation academy that they offer that is for faculty, not just extension. And I really would encourage it if you have the opportunity to take any of those programs, because I think a lot of times the challenge as an agent is transferring from that knowledge based. I have the answers into this. I'm not here for answers. I'm here to help guide a conversation. And I think that skill set is really valuable. So if you have an opportunity, I would encourage you to take that.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of add on like it's the at least in my experience, working with Extension, there's so many different personalities as agents. Some are more geared towards being more emotionally in tune or being that empath and kind of can read other people's emotions. Not everybody's like that. So having, I know sometimes I know agents look at, getting in touch with themselves, knowing themselves, emotions, and all that kind of stuff seems like kumbaya, let's sit around the campfire, hold hands. But at the end of the day, it really does help us become in tune with not only ourselves, but be able to pick up on other people's emotions. And that's a big part of this. So it's not just about the knowledge and being technical, but it's about understanding people and their stories and where they're at and being able to be that bridge to get them to um, the next step in whatever their future goals and vision for that farm is.
We got two questions. The first one is, do you have templates for the vision resource board? You may have said that a little bit as well, et cetera, that were mentioned in your slides.
Yeah, I have some that I've used mainly on the vision and some of the resources locally that I have that I use. It's not necessarily like a broadcasted out template or set of resources, but I'd be happy to share that with you if you want to, Miss Jennifer, if you want to send me an email or shoot me an email, I'll be happy to get that to you. Or I can share it with, I don't know if we share it out with everybody, but I can definitely get that to y'all. Just some of the stuff I've used in the past.
Okay. The next question could be both of y'all. How are you connecting with farm families in Georgia? Is it through workshops, one-on-one consulting?
Robyn, do you want to start that one?
Yeah, so my neck of the woods is predominantly one-on-one. So Georgia, we still are a agent in every county operation, so we have an ag agent everywhere. So most of us are handling a lot of our conversations kind of interpersonally within our offices and within our communities. I do know we've had a couple of different opportunities for succession planning, kind of workshops or field days, things like that. So I do know we have some of those that are happening, but I think the bulk majority is still pretty interpersonal. Is that right,
And
Blake?
yeah, I would say the biggest part of this, where we can fit and why we're a benefit, is I feel like we can be an unbiased third party, but we also have that trust with our producers. And I think that comes from our one-on-one interactions and being able to build those connections. Because a lot of, and it might be one generation over the other, mind you, because like I'm a younger agent, so I might connect better with the younger generations and can have conversations with them a little bit easier. Maybe they're open up and they can trust me a little bit more because they see kind of we're on the same wavelength. And it might be a little bit harder with an older generation in me in my age to really connect right away. But being around and doing workshops and things like that continue to build that reputation with the clientele. And that's kind of what I've seen is the younger generation has been a quicker for me, but that the older generation has taken a little bit more time and putting in more of that my own sweat equity to build that trust, if that makes sense.
I'm gonna keep going down the line. Um, Someone's asking about the recording. Yes, part one is on YouTube at NACAA. And this recording will be on YouTube within 24 hours to 48 hours. Scott does a great job. Please, Nathan did the part one, so please give him some likes and shares. He would definitely love that. But yes, all of the 365 webinars are on YouTube. And Scott's going to say it'll be up in 4 hours, so he wastes no time. Uh, the next question: do you see differences working with first generation small farms with non-family successors versus multi-generation family transitions?
Robyn, you want to go or you want me to go first on that one?
I mean, I admittedly am in a community where we do not have as much production agriculture. The vast majority of my clients are more homesteady, small farm type operations. And I think that that shapes a lot of the conversation as well. The majority of people I'm working with are going to be technically first generation, bought 50 acres in my county and are trying to make something of it. So there is, I think, a little bit more intentionality around building sustainability from them because they're starting from scratch and they see firsthand the amount of infrastructure and planning and economics and things that go into being successful in a way that I think our older generations have lived for so long that they just kind of know it intuitively. So I would say I see a little bit more intentionality early on from those producers I work with directly.
And I'll say coming in from a non-family side, I think you lose some of the weight that comes with a family and multi-generational farming aspect. I mean, the expectations for the kids and the identities of the multi-generation, the pride and all that, the history isn't there. I've found more and more of the younger generation or a new first time where they're wanting that sustainable future for their next generation right off the bat. Like Robyn said, like they're already coming in with that mind. And yes, farms that are multi-generational, they still have that in their mind, but they don't have that identity tied to it yet, if that makes sense, where they're that invested with that specific, it has to be this way. I've seen more willingness to kind of diversify and do whatever it takes to survive for their children with those first time farms or the non-family successor. You just want to see that survival piece first, and they're open to doing whatever it takes to do that. So you lose some of the emotional piece, I think, is the best way to explain it. But yes, I do see a big difference in dealing with the two.
Okay. I will just make sure I read the statement. You can add as well. But I've had several conversations with middle generation, and they are trying to navigate succession planning with a reluctant older generation who is hard to get to the table or open up to the desires and plans for the farm. So, if you want to add to that comment or anything else, I think
Yeah,
you've already said some things as well.
I'll say this because I actually have a really good buddy. He's a farmer of mine, but we've become more than just work acquaintances. We've become genuine friends, and that was one of the things that we've opened. He opened up first thing he ever did, come in my office, and we sat down for 3 hours, and through our conversation, he was hinting at some of the frustrations he was having with his father, who was having some health issues, but still wanted to control the farm. And it became that lag of, okay, I'm still waiting on my dad to answer me on this question, or he's saying I should go spray this instead, or whatever. But every time he would bring up, hey, we need to start thinking about maybe you stepping back and me stepping up, um, he would always shoot it down. And so we had very long conversations about how to just open up. And one of the ways that he has found the most success through our talks has been trying to get, in his case, his mom being a voice for him as well, and being able to be a kind of a soother between the two different personalities, and being that bridge. In their relationship, it worked out where there was just that one person that could really, no matter what, his dad's going to listen to her, right? And she's going to be able to get through to him when it was kind of difficult for him to want to have that conversation. And so in his case, identifying that person that can help be a an ally or a mediator like us, like depends on, the situation with extension agents, we can play that role. In his case, it was his mom that helped facilitate that a little bit easier and kind of opened the father up to have those conversations. And they have started transitioning right now. I actually talked to him last month. Since I've moved counties, we don't see each other as often, but they've already started making that transition start to take place. So it's taken 2.5 years, but after some long conversations, they've started making some progress. So keep after it, but maybe have that identify that key individual that can really be your breakthrough person.
Okay. Uh, Nathan, Blake, and Robyn, is there a part three to this series here?
Oh, this is it. I know good things come in threes, but that's why you got me, Robyn, and Nathan on here. But I do want to give a shout out to our other members that couldn't be a part of this meeting. One of them actually emailed me, Makayla Gertz, and she is actually on the way to the hospital about to have a baby. So y'all keep her in your thoughts and prayers. And same with Sam. She's with Penn State. She's going to be going out on maternity leave in the next month as well with a new baby. So keep them in your thoughts and prayers. We appreciate it.
Well, I know we tried to get them on this Zoom, but the babies came priority. So, but I do not see no more comments or questions or statements in the chat box. Scanning the screen. Round of applause. Great presentation.
Thank you.
And thank you. And it will be on YouTube before sunset. So
Awesome. Well,
Awesome.
thank y'all so
Thank you.
much.
thank you. And Scott's going to